what can I say? The day the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a report saying 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, don't get beyond that. We passed that this year.
Yeah.
The day after that report came out, marijuana became legal in Canada. And guess what dominated the news from then on? When a report came out from the United Nations that over half of the species that were on this planet when I was born in 1936 are now extinct, and another million are poised to go extinct. The next day, Harry and Meghan had a baby. And guess what went extinct in the media? The report on extinction. You ask me, why are we not paying attention? I don't know, but we sure as hell don't want to face what the science is telling us.
1988, the world's top scientists warned us climate change was our greatest threat after nuclear war. We heard the alarm, but we hit the snooze button. Year after year, decade after decade. Meanwhile, emissions climbed, ecosystems crumbled, and tipping points passed quietly. David Suzuki, once hopeful, now sounds a different note. It might be too late. He doesn't blame science. The evidence has been clear all along. He blames the systems, politics obsessed with power, and economies addicted to endless growth. We choose short-term profits over long-term survival, quarterly gains over planetary health. Suzuki says if these systems won't change, then maybe we should stop pretending. Stop pretending we're going to solve the crisis and start bracing for what's coming. Because if we keep prioritizing money over nature, giving up might not be a choice, it'll be a consequence. We're going to react to David Suzuki's controversial comment on a CBC News radio station that he made, and we're going to talk about maybe he regrets a little of it and says that we still should keep fighting. We're going to talk about all this stuff on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about something that is very familiar to a lot of conservationists, a lot of ocean scientists, and just wildlife scientists in general. We're going to be talking about climate change and how we feel at certain times when we discuss climate change, whether it's in an interview, whether it is with somebody in our family or in our friend group, and how we talk about it. Because there's some times where we talk very positively. We're very optimistic of the changes that we're seeing, maybe behind the scenes or in our work, and we see little changes get bigger and bigger and bigger. And every once in a while, we see a huge change, whether it be in policy, a government, what have you. It doesn't matter. We start to see this change. And other times, we just start to be really realistic. And we start to really wonder all these things that are happening over time and are happening recently, whether we're really serious about protecting the environment. And are we serious about protecting the environment over the economy and politics? That seems to have changed what we used to do compared to what we do now, and not for the better and not to help climate change. There was a recent interview that was done by David Suzuki. If you don't know who David Suzuki is a renowned Canadian geneticist, environmentalist, author, and science broadcaster, best known for his lifelong dedication to promoting environmental awareness and climate action. Born in 1936 in Vancouver, British Columbia, he began his career as a geneticist, earning a PhD in zoology from the University of Chicago, and later became a professor at the University of British Columbia. Suzuki rose to prominence as the longtime host of The Nature of Things, a CBC television program that brought science and environmental issues into Canadian households for over 4 decades. Think about David Attenborough, that was Canadian. He authored more than 50 books, including The Sacred Balance, and co-founded the David Suzuki Foundation, a nonprofit focused on the environmental research, education, and advocacy. Over the years, David Suzuki has become one of the most influential voices in the global environmental movement, known for speaking out on climate change, biodiversity loss, indigenous rights, and the failures of modern political and economic systems to protect the natural world. His work has earned him numerous awards, including the Order of Canada, the UNESCO Kalinga Prize for Science Communication, and multiple honorary degrees. Despite controversy and criticism from some political and industrial groups, Suzuki remains a fearless advocate for urgent climate action, social justice, and to the protection of Earth's life support systems. That is the basis of it. I grew up watching David Suzuki on The Nature of Things, a CBC classic. And I don't know if it still continues today, but David Suzuki has been that voice. When I first came out with Speak Up for Blue, I had this list of ocean leaders that I wanted to discuss. And I would contact each one of them and say, hey, can I put your name down on my website as an ocean leader, where if they click on your name, it'll go to the website and give a bio. So that one was going to lead to the David Suzuki Foundation or others that I really admired. And I had a whole list on the website. I don't have that now. But I have to admit, when I contacted David Suzuki Foundation and David Suzuki himself, this was during a very controversial time in Canada anyway. The Prime Minister was Prime Minister Harper. He was a staunch conservative, very right-wing, very pro-oil and gas and natural resource exploitation. And David Suzuki and him had a back and forth over the airwaves, and not like face-to-face, but they definitely were critical of each other. In fact, Prime Minister Harper almost at one point called him an eco-terrorist, which was incredibly irresponsible of a politician when they don't hear what they want. We probably heard that before recently. If they don't hear what they like, they start to criticize and they start to call people terrorists, especially on the ecological level. So it was a very tense time in environmental and political and economical sort of time period, if you really think about it, back in the early 2010s to about 2015 until the Trudeau government got in. Now, since then, it's been very interesting to see the progression that we've made towards climate change and changing and reducing climate change, as well as kind of going away from it at the same time here in Canada. Our economy is based on natural resources. Our major natural resource that we export is oil and gas. There are a lot of battles on the East Coast and on the West Coast, especially on the East Coast, for extracting oil and gas, and of course in Alberta and even northern Saskatchewan to be able to take out the natural gas as well as oil in the tar sands to export more oil and give more profits, not only the province, but also to Canada in general. And so when oil prices dip down, our economy dips down. When they go up, we go up. And sometimes you can't make 2 cents of it. I can't make 2 cents of it a lot of the times. And that just happens every once in a while. And we have to deal with it. Unfortunately, as we progress and we continue to see decisions being made for politics and economical reasons and not protection of environment, seems to be always third place or even less, we start to see more climate change consequences happening. There was an interview that was done on CBC News that I'm going to be reacting to in just a moment. I want to set it up a little bit. David Suzuki is speaking to a CBC host. It almost looks like CBC radio, but now they're putting all on TV, of course. YouTube, I'm putting this on YouTube. Everything, a talk show can always be in video as well. And you can see throughout the interview that David Suzuki is not happy. He is frustrated. He is just seeing the reality of climate change and the decisions we've made towards reducing climate change or lack thereof. And so he talks about that. You're going to see a very frustrated person. I want you to remember, this guy is a scientist, a world-renowned scientist. He's taught many years. He lives what he preaches, and he's a very good science communicator. But you can tell he's older now. He's in his 80s, and he's fed up. He's fed up with the decisions, and he's been like that since the Harper administration has been in. And it's just been, people started to criticize because he's always negative. But to be honest, he's been a realist for a long time. And if they don't like what he hears, then they just don't like him. So we're going to talk a couple of themes that we're going to do. I don't know if I'll go through the entire video, but we are definitely going to react to some of it. So let's get into that and let's start reacting to some of it. I'm just going to play it from the beginning. This is from CBC News. I'll put the link in the show notes so that you can access it, so that you can watch it from YouTube or from wherever I found this on YouTube. So here, let's just listen in and see what is happening.
I think the science has been in now for decades, and yet look at us. When we had the best environment minister we've ever had in Canada, in Stephen Guilbeault, and I told him, you can't even tell us the truth, how bad it is. We haven't taken this as the opportunity to really change the way that we behave, get onto a new energy future. We've got now a prime minister who, thanks to Mr. Trump, got elected, to everyone's surprise.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about this part here. As I said, I'm going to be stopping a couple of times. Before this last election where Prime Minister Carney became the official prime minister, he was appointed prime minister once Prime Minister Trudeau resigned, and then he came in, but then he had an election pretty much within like 3 months after he was appointed because he wanted to make sure that the people wanted him in. It was a surprise win for sure. And it was very interesting. The reason why he got in was because, Trump was in power since January of 2025, depending on when you're watching this. And he decided that he was going to attack Canada and the world, apparently, through tariffs. But he kept talking about how not only was Canada, quote unquote, unfair in terms of the trade that we were doing with the United States, which was interesting because Trump did negotiate the last, North American free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And he's basically saying it was the worst trade deal of all time, even though he's the one who negotiated it, came out of that time, like in his first term, and said, hey, this was the best negotiated trade deal ever. It is what it is. This is what Trump does. And I don't want to go into that aspect of it, but it really shaped the election for Canada. We had somebody that was running for prime minister for the Liberals who, and for you guys in the United States, it's like the Democrats for Canada, who was a banker. He had a lot of international experience. He had worked with Great Britain during the Brexit that time and that transfer over, and they loved him there for the most part, except for one prime minister who was a prime minister for about 45 days. She didn't like him, but everybody else seemed to like him. He has a pretty good rapport there, reputation. He was the chair of the Bank of Canada at one point, and now he's the prime minister. He became the prime minister because of the pressure from Trump, because of his international economic experience. That was a confidence vote for us. The person he was running against, Pierre Poilievre, did not have that international economic experience. He wasn't a banker. He was more of a lifelong politician. So people are like, hey, you know what? Even though Liberals weren't projected to win before this started, they became the fan favorite because of this type of deal. Now, with that said, Mark Carney, as a prime minister, is pretty much center left. Some can argue center right at times. He's a banker, so he's very conservative in what he moves. He wants to equate everything. He likes to be socially and fiscally responsible. So that's both conservative as well as liberal, even, NDP's type of work, New Democratic Party. So a little bit more to the left, depending on what he's looking at, which seems fair. Canada, well, apart from the last 10, 15 years or so, has been usually center left or center right. We don't really fare that far off from the center. But the problem is now because of the pressure of Trump at one point wanted Canada to be the 51st state. Obviously, that got rejected right away. I think what became a joke became kind of serious in the Trump sort of rhetoric, but people were refuting that right away. But it definitely united Canada during this election in making sure that the right people got voted in, or what Canada thought was the right people to get voted in. I'm sure there's some people who will disagree with that. But regardless, that's what happened. But because of that pressure from the South that David Suzuki is talking about here, is we had to start to look elsewhere for a oil and gas partner because the U.S. was going to put 10% tariffs on us. That wasn't going to do. So we had finished a pipeline under the Trudeau government that started when he first started, where the pipeline went out to the Eastern market. So China and other Asian countries, Japan and so forth. And so that was good for us. And then now there's talk that what was shut down earlier was an eastern pipeline to go from Alberta all the way out to the East Coast across Canada, which is a big place if you don't know. And that would go towards European markets. So the start of talking about building that is happening. And so now we are promoting more fossil fuel extraction, which we were hoping to get away from under the last government. Here's the problem is that we start talking about the economy. And this is where David Suzuki starts talking about the economy and politics. And he's got a point here.
And there's no one that I've met who knows more about the climate crisis than Mark Carney. I mean, he's written about it before he became a politician. But he's still talking about pipelines. You know, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said years ago, any further investment in fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. What have we been doing? You know, how many billions have we spent on the pipeline, the Southern Pipeline?
The Trans Mountain Pipeline, yeah.
We're talking about more, you know, like one of the things that Antonio Guterres is one of the few people up there with prominence saying it like it is. You know, we're digging our own grave. And when you're doing that, the first thing to do is stop digging.
Now, I want to talk another point that he makes, which I agree. Not only has Canada come out with prioritizing these types of energy projects. So, even though Canada is trying to balance the energy projects with fossil fuels as well as renewables, or they're saying they are, there's definitely more investment right now, or some investment into oil and gas, more than what we anticipated before this election. Not surprising because of the pressure from the South and the fact that they're putting tariffs, and we need to start relying on other countries and not just US. I think it's like 90 to 95% of our oil is exported to the US. So they're our main client in that respect. They get a lot of their oil and gas from us. So we want to make sure that we're not just stuck with that. Our prices are low because of that. And because our economy is tied so much to the oil and gas, that makes a big deal. So when we're talking about the future, so now, you're starting to see the pressure of more oil and gas talk happening. And again, it comes down to, even though Mark Carney and others are wanting to lower and reduce climate change, how much can we do it? How much can we do? We continue to develop oil and gas and not reduce it as we were told a while ago. And under the Paris Agreement, that's what we should be doing. But we continue to do that. And there's a lot. This is not an easy thing. It's not just a matter of like, let's cut oil and gas, go down to like 30% of our energy use because it's easy. It's not easy. There are a lot of jobs that are tied to it. There's a lot of politics tied to it. There's a lot of lobby groups tied to this. And on the other side, there's a lot of environmentalists and conservationists who are trying to reduce that amount because we care about the planet. And, others care more about profit. Some people care about their jobs and their livelihoods. And that's where it gets really contested when it comes into this. So it's never an easy decision. And for those of you who are going to comment, this is an easy decision. Either way, it's not an easy decision. It's a very complex problem that Canada's in. It's put themselves in for a long time. Even though a lot of our energy, about 80% of our energy is renewable, we still use and export a lot of fossil fuels. And if we continue to develop that, to export them more, we're going to be contributing more towards climate change worldwide because we're exporting and we're developing our markets so that we're going to be producing more oil and gas. That's my understanding of it. If it's a different understanding, please let me know. Love to have you on the show to discuss that. But that's what he's talking about here. We're digging our own grave and continuing to do that. So let's continue on with what he had to say.
We're still arguing about fossil fuels and the future in our economy.
And tell me about that, because here we are, of course, we have this threat of tariffs from the United States. We have everyone agreeing that Canada needs to be more self-sufficient, more independent, and more clear of the United States when it comes to trading and to find better partners. Part of that is we need to exploit the resources that we have in this country, whether those are mineral resources, whether it's natural gas, or whether it's bitumen buried in the dirt. And when people...
You can see David Suzuki starting to get frustrated by this, because this has been the rhetoric for a long time. We have these natural resources. We need to get them out of the ground for our economy to stabilize. So this is going to be an interesting answer.
People are having these conversations now. It's as though climate change doesn't exist.
I agree. And, when this whole 51st state issue came up and, people began to say, buy Canadian. And I said to my wife, okay, you're going shopping for groceries this week. Only get food that is grown and made in Canada. Well, we'll starve then. You look at, we are one of the bread baskets of the world, and we can't even feed our own people with food grown in our own country. Why? Because of globalization. Globalization is a problem now, and the most powerful, the richest country in the world has elected a man who is a climate denier. And we're at this critical point.
This happens a lot too. It's not just down south where, Donald Trump is a climate change denier. This happens in a lot of cases where one party over the other thinks that climate change is not real. The other party thinks it's real, not just in the US, not just in Canada, but you have a lot of other countries who do the same thing, and their government flip-flops every so often, whether it's 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever that might be. They flip-flop every so often, and the change in policies you can see are either done or undone. Right. And we saw that with Trump. Every time he comes in, he takes the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He reduces a lot of the regulations for the EPA, for NOAA, and a number of different environmental organizations within the government, does whatever he can to deregulate and to make sure that oil and gas and fossil fuel companies can do better and can develop more, because they think that's the way to go. That's the old school way of thinking, develop fossil fuels and exploit natural resources, and we will be able to do it so well. Now, in Canada, we had the federal and Ontario provincial governments both put in policies that actually allow the deregulation of Species at Risk Act for both federal and the Ontario province, and allows more development to happen. So in the federal government, it will be oil and gas projects and pipeline projects, because there's a lot of environmental regulations that you have to go through to make sure that you are not destroying the environment as you're putting in these pipelines. Every time you cross a river or a stream or a lake, you have to make sure that you go under the proper process. If they're in a species at risk, it slows down the process. And every time it's slow for a reason, to make sure that we're not destroying the habitat of these species, but also making sure that we're not destroying the environment for our general health. And so a lot of people just see that from the business side. Hey, we're just going to forget the environment. We want to move faster on this. It's better for the economy. And that's the excuse that they use over and over and over again. And even I think they're both Bill C5s for the federal government and the Ontario government, where they're actually stomping on Indigenous rights to take away the decision-making for Indigenous peoples and to be able to, put that together. So it's a really interesting situation that we're in, where we're seeing a lot of environmental regulations get deregulated to allow for this push of fossil fuel industries. And, David Suzuki's tired of it. A lot of us are tired of it. And we kind of saw this coming. I kind of agree that we have to do this, but I hate it. I hate the fact that we have to do this, because it's going to ruin our environment even more.
The science has been in for decades. In 1988, at a major international conference in Toronto, the delegate, opened by newly elected Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, keynote address by the Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland. Stephen Lewis chaired the sessions. At the end of that, in 1988, they said global warming, we called it global warming back then, represents a threat second only to an all-out global nuclear war. And that was it. They made a call for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. If we had done it, we would have saved billions of dollars and many, many countless lives, and we didn't do anything,
That really hit me. I forgot about that because I was a kid when that happened. And if we had been able to, reduce our emissions back then by 20%, maybe we could have been on a better path. But what happened during that time was where the misinformation level increased by fossil fuel companies. That's where you started to see companies like Imperial Oil and others start to shell out these reports that climate change wasn't actually happening, really getting into the political parties and, having one political party just deny it. Other political parties are for reducing climate change, and it really put a divide politically in how you voted. So if you are a Democrat or a liberal here in Canada, if you weren't going to vote for conservatives because they were anti-climate, if environment was anti-climate action, if the environment was important to you. If the economy was important to you, that was going against the environment, because that's how the fossil fuel kind of saw it. It's like, hey, you're impeding job creation, you're impeding money for Canada, you're impeding money for your country, wherever country you do. This happens all the time. And they were shown to say, yeah, we lied. Like, we allowed this misinformation to get through. And some of them are paying the price in courts right now as they're getting sued for that misinformation. But they did it for decades, and it worked. Instead of taking those 15 years from 1988 and onwards and reducing our emissions by 20%, therein right, just solving the problem at that point, or getting closer to solving the problem, we would have been in a much better situation than we are now. Now we are seeing the consequences. Now we are seeing the consequences of our lack of action over the last 40, 50, 60 years, when climate change was first sort of discovered and ignored throughout that entire time. And now we're starting to see the consequences in more earthquakes, more volcanoes, tsunami warnings, especially since recent. We're starting to see increased sea surface temperature, coral reef bleaching. We're starting to see storm surges are increasing, sea level rises increasing, storms are increasing in intensity, and they're happening more frequently. So 1,000-year, 100-year, 10-year storms are no longer, relevant at this point. That was how we used it in the past. We are seeing those more than 100 years since the last 100-year storm, or 10 years. We're seeing those every like 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And they're happening more and more often, and they're creating more damage, which we have to pay the money for. We never really talk about how much money is paid for that and wasted on paying for, cleaning up something that we could have cleaned up before, clean up the consequences of stuff we cleaned up where we wouldn't have seen those consequences. We rarely talk about those. Now, I'm not going to continue on because this is going to be a longer video, but David Suzuki does go on and say, hey, you know what? We continue to prioritize politics and economy over the environment. That seems to be what he's saying here. Until we stop doing that, we're not going to see a change in climate change. We're not going to be able to go back and be okay. We're in a time now, if we continue on this path, we're just going to have to adapt and just suffer the consequences until we can't do anything after that. Only one thing we can do is just accept the consequences after a certain time, because at some point there's a tipping point where we just can't go back, and we're getting closer and closer to that tipping point. Whether you agree with me or not, that's just a fact. It's happening, and we're seeing it now. We're starting to see all these different consequences that are coming up, and we're seeing larger and larger scale consequences. Case in point, the tsunami that we had recently because of an 8.8 magnitude earthquake, which is pretty rare in the sea at this point. Last time it happened was in 2011, where we had a tsunami in Japan that killed hundreds of thousands of people, plus almost caused a nuclear power plant to go on the fritz, which I'm saying that lightly because that's not what we want. But regardless, this is what he continues to say. Now, he hit a lot of criticism because of it. People are saying, hey, you know what? He got a lot of flack for it. Why is he talking about this? He's just an old man. He's just grumpy and this and that. It's because he's been fighting all this time. But because of that flack, there was another video done on CBC. And this is where I find it really interesting, where you see conservationists, activists, and environmentalists start to really go back and forth between reality and pessimism and optimism. And it depends on some of these reasons and the personal reasons. So I'm going to show you another clip. This is on TikTok that I found this. It's with CBC again. It's actually David Suzuki speaking with his daughter, Sarika Kula Suzuki, about the comments that he made, and him just being like, did I say that? Is that something I said? Oh, wow, you have kids. I want their grandkids not to have to go through this. And it scares me every time that I hear about this type of news. So I want you to just kind of see this happening, and we're just going to kind of listen to it as we go through. So here it is.
Sometimes I hear you say, what's the point? And then your actions speak so much louder than your words. You're always on the front lines. You're always saying something. You're always making these shows that talk about important issues. Like, you haven't given up.
No, of course not. Because when you have children and grandchildren, you have no choice. My agony now is that I know there's going to be a turbulent life ahead for your children. And I'm not going to be there to help fight for them.
I remember when I told you I was pregnant for the first time, and you couldn't even look at me. You were so upset.
Is that true?
Yes, for the whole. So
I'm sorry.
you were the next day. I said to you, I mean, I know you're not going to be happy about it, but why are you so mad at me? And you said, Sarika, if you believe everything that I have told you during your life, why would you bring another person into this world?
Wow. Really? Did I say that?
Yes, you said that.
Oh, my God.
And I understand what you meant, because you've devoted your whole life to this fight. And that's why it destroyed me when the twins were born and you were holding them and you started crying and said, I just realized that these children will not be able to live out their lives. And then I realized that I don't have to think that way, that I can envision a different future. And if I devote my life to fighting for that future, that maybe there will be a different future for them. Yeah.
I still have hope. I believe that hope is action. We're affirming hope by doing. If you don't do and you say, well, it's too late, there's nothing I can, you've given up, basically.
Nope, I haven't given up.
You can't.
I can't.
You cannot.
I can't give up.
That's the crux of it, right? Is how do we balance the realism that we see as scientists and as conservationists, And we see these reports come in from the IPCC, from different government organizations, like different government departments all over the world, and other nonprofit organizations and think tanks and so forth that continue to talk about the consequences of climate change and the inaction that we've taken, or the steps back that we've taken. If we've progressed a little bit, there have been some step backs depending on who's in power. We're at a point right now in the world where there are a lot of conservative governments that are in power. And they have taken a number of steps back from a lot of different things that surround climate change. You know, there's eco-justice, there's diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that help with climate change action and voicing up those actions and listening to different people. There's actually just the defunding of science, the defunding of monitoring systems that will help adapt to these consequences, such as tsunamis and storm surges and increased storms, and detecting those storms to make sure that we are in a position where we can help, and the government as well as other entities can help inform people of when to evacuate, when not to evacuate, and how to prepare for storms. These are all at risk. And so when you have people like myself, like David Suzuki, like anybody who is working in this world, even though you have hope and you have to continue to fight, and we all have to continue to fight, there are times where we're just like, what the hell? What is wrong with us? Why do we continue to do this? We are going after short-term gains with long-term consequences coming down the road, when the people in power are not going to pay for those long-term consequences. They are going to put in the people that they want. They are going to make a mockery of climate change. You know, scientists and people who want climate change action, they're going to deny it. They're going to pay for misinformation to be put on social media, bots to be put in comments, will probably be in my comments here, or people who are a product of that misinformation who are going to be in these comments saying that, Andrew, you know, like all this is BS and all that kind of stuff. That's what's going to happen. And we're going to see that, and we're going to continue to see that, but we have to continue to fight. And at some point, there's going to be times where we're going to have low points. We're going to be like, Jesus, what the hell are people thinking? What are we thinking here? You have, you know, people in my province that are in charge, the premier, who is helping his billion-dollar friends make more billions by encroaching on a green zone area that is not supposed to be touched because it is absolutely crucial to our systems here just north of Toronto, to put in another highway so that they can put in homes in that area to benefit his billionaire friends. He doesn't have to put it in this green zone. He doesn't have to. He could put it somewhere else, but they don't own land there. So why would you do that? Right? Because they're benefiting. It's scandals, and they're out in the open and nobody's paying for it. Nobody's being held accountable for these decisions, and they're not going to be held accountable in 10, 15, 20 years down the road when nobody's going to remember who they are. They're just going to remember how they are dealing with this crap, how they are dealing with the consequences of climate change because of bad political decisions, all the way stemming that back to 1988, and even you can argue further, when governments continue to ignore the science that has always been there. You heard David say, it's always been there. It's been right for a long time. And it's been there for a long time and refused to do it. So when you get scientists like myself, like David Suzuki, obviously I'm not comparing, we are definitely not the same type of scientist. He is way above my intellect as well as experience. But when you start to see people like himself, David Attenborough, others, start to speak out and be like, we are actually very frustrated. We are looking back at our lives and we are seeing how many times governments made the wrong decisions. And wrong decisions against the environment to prioritize political power and economic growth, unlimited economic growth. And this is the frustration that we have. And this is why I'm taking so long to put this video together, because it is a pain in the ass to deal with all this time. And then, you know, somebody like David Suzuki gets flack for coming out and saying real stuff like he says all the time. You know, he's been labeled an eco-terrorist. He's been labeled an enemy of Canada by different political parties and different organizations, like in companies who don't like what he says. But to be honest, he's just saying what the science says. And he's trying to navigate ways that we can do better, right? That's really what it comes down to. And he is getting punished for it. And you can even see at times he struggles with hope, because hope turns into action. And also the realism that we see based on the decisions that we continue to make. And sometimes they're not easy decisions that these governments are making, but we continue to see that the economy and that political power is prioritized over the environmental protection of just our planet. And it's extremely frustrating. So I can understand what David Suzuki is going through. I can understand the controversy. Like, when my daughters, at some point, they will have, maybe daughters or sons, and I'll have grandchildren, and they'll have children, and they'll have grandchildren. I want them to enjoy their life. I don't want them to have to worry about floods. I don't want them to have to worry about droughts. I don't want them to have to worry about anything that's climate change related, any natural disasters that are exacerbated by climate change. I don't want to see that happen. I don't want to even know that's going to happen. That doesn't give me hope. That gives me a lot of pessimism. You're starting to see people who do not want to have kids because of climate change and the effect that it's going to have on our planet in the next couple of decades. So that's the reason. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this. If you're a scientist or a conservationist or environmentalist in any type of field, do you have this same type of battle between the realism and the optimism? As well, I would love to hear from people who are not in the conservation industry or science industry or field. I would love to hear what you think. Do you think all like what David Suzuki is going through is legitimate? Are you go through the same thing? I would love to hear, your thoughts. Put in the comments in the YouTube comments down below. Or if you're listening to this on audio, just hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. Or you can go to speakupforblue.com/contact and you can contact me there. Just fill out the form. It goes right to my personal email. And you want to take action? Join the Undertow. It's an online community that we are creating. The app is coming, but we are creating this online community to help guide you to do better action to protect the ocean and the planet. All you have to do is go to speakupforblue.com/join the Undertow. I want to thank you so much for having the patience to listen to me rant and rave and go through this video, and just the love that you're giving me on YouTube as well as on audio, and the fact that you listen to these podcast episodes, whether it's this one, How to Protect the Ocean, or Beyond Jaws. I really appreciate the fact that you listen all the way through, because you have to listen all the way through to hear this, but I really do appreciate you, and I'd love to hear from you and engage with you, because that's what forms this community. That's what makes it really great. So I want to thank you again, and this has been another episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, from the True North Strong and Free. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.